if you're here, if you're in this meeting, that means you've joined the presentation called The Brave New World of Immunotherapy, Targeting the Immune System to Treat Disease. So that's what we will be talking about today. Before we get started, I would like to just take a moment to mention that although we're not physically on Carleton campus, it's important to recognize that Carleton is located on the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. So here with us today is Dr. Cassol. She's an associate professor at Carleton who specializes in immunology, infectious disease, and immunometabolism. I hope I said that right. And again, if you are here, that means we are about to jump into the brave new world of immunotherapy, targeting the immune system to treat disease. Before I hand it over to Dr. Cassol, I just wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end for any questions. So feel free to type these into the chat. There is a Q&A feature on the side here, as well as a general chat feature, which you're welcome to use. And I think that's good. So okay. Thank you so much for Dr. Cassol for joining us. I'll hand it over.
And thank you for having me. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, hope that looks good. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Edana Cassol, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences. So I'm also the co-director of the Tissue Engineering and Applied Materials Hub. And so it's actually a joint initiative with the Faculty of Engineering where we're trying to engineer tissue from human cells and sort of other materials to generate sort of systems to do basic research as well as clinical research. And I'm also an affiliate researcher at the Briere Research Institute. And so as Sarah mentioned, my research is really focused on understanding how the immune system interacts with and sort of deals with infection, so viruses and bacteria. And then my other interest is really about understanding how we can use that to improve immune functionality in the various different diseases. And so my research sort of encompasses two ends. So we do very mechanistic, basic science research in the lab, but we also do a lot of translational research. And so for some of you that may not be familiar with the term, translational research is really about using clinical samples and tissues from people with disease and really trying to use that information to inform new therapies and treatments. So some of the areas of research, I work in a variety of different areas. So some of my work is related to aging and understanding how to improve vaccine responses in aging individuals. I do some work in the context of chronic wounds, so to target the immune system to help improve healing for people with things like bed sores. I also do some work at the level of HIV-related research, so how to improve responses to therapies in HIV-infected individuals. And then I also try to use information about viruses to help treat cancers, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So I am an immunologist, and so I admit I'm completely biased. I think that the immune system is the most interesting organ system in the body. When most of us think about the immune system, we think about how it plays a role in protecting us from infection. And it makes sense. I mean, that's what it's really the main purpose of the immune system. It differentiates and it can recognize between host and non-host proteins or invaders. So if you have a bacteria or a virus that enters into the body, your cells are able to recognize it as a foreign agent and able to destroy it. But it's actually so much more complicated than that, just like with everything in the human body. It has these unique features where it's able to differentiate between different types of invading agents, so different responses for parasites versus bacteria versus viruses. And then if you think about it, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term the microbiome. We're actually, as on a daily basis, we're in contact with millions of different microorganisms. And so our immune system is actually able to differentiate between and only mount immune responses against bacteria and viruses that cause disease, so pathogens. Well, there's a lot of other microorganisms in our body that are helpful, that are good for us, that we don't mount an immune response to. So it's not just about differentiating between what's host and what's foreign. It's so much more subtle than that. And again, I'm not going to go into all of these details, but just recognizing that the immune system is composed of a variety of different cells, and we can target different aspects of the immune system to improve its functionality. Most of my research is in the first line of defense, so the innate immunity. So these are the cells that recognize and really initiate immune responses. And these responses are required to activate the more specialized immune cells that are sort of like the killers and the sort of helpers of the response. But again, immune therapies and the world of immune therapies are targeting all of these different cell types, depending on the type of disease, to improve and treat disease. So again, most of us think about infection when we think about the immune system, and it's right, because that's one of the main purposes of the immune system. And so this is just an example. So this is a movie where you have a parasite it's in a petri dish, so it's in vitro, but you can see these are eosinophils, and they detect the parasite in the culture, and then they immediately swarm and destroy it. And that's what they're so effective at doing. But the immune system obviously does so much more than that. It can also regulate, it also responds to other agents that might be outside of infections. So for example, if anyone suffers from allergies, if our immune system's not functioning correctly, what happens is that our immune system starts to recognize things that we normally wouldn't induce an immune response to. So things like animal dander, pollen, a bee sting, peanut allergies. And that's generally not something that we want. So immunotherapies can play a role in treating things like allergies. The other thing that can happen is when our immune system's not functioning properly, it can start to not lose the ability to recognize between host and pathogen or microorganism or foreign invader. And that's often when the immune cells start to recognize host proteins. That's when you start to have things like autoimmune diseases. So it's the immune system recognizing its own cells and starting to attack its own body. So obviously immune therapies can play an important role there as well. And the immune cells play so much more. They do so much more than just, surveilling and removing infection. They actually play a really important role in maintaining tissue homeostasis. And so making sure each tissue is healthy and functioning. If you have a cut or an injury, it plays an important role in tissue and remodeling and repair. So it sort of makes you realize that, when you start to have deficiency or defects in the immune system, you also start to have other types of disease. And that's because our immune system and the functionality of our immune system is very much dependent on our environment. And a lot of things in our environment can affect the ability of our immune system to respond. So obviously there's things like infectious diseases like HIV that deplete one of the main immune cell subsets, and you don't actually end up succumbing to the virus, but other co-infections that you become susceptible to. But even things like malnutrition cause immunodeficiency, or aging plays an important role. So as we age, we lose the ability to respond to different types of infections. And it also contributes to development of other types of diseases. And so some of the drugs we take, if anyone's ever taken steroids or something like that, that can be immunosuppressive. Stress is immunosuppressive, and that's often why during exam periods, the students get sick with the flu, because, the stress causes the immune system to become less functional. We become sick more easily. But again, when we're talking about changes in the immune responsiveness, we're not just talking about increased risk of infection, we're also talking about potential for other diseases. And so cancer is a good example of when our immune system doesn't function as well as it should, we increase our risk for cancer as well as other diseases. And so aging is actually a very good example of how the immune system contributes to disease. Dysfunction in the immune system contributes to disease. And so again, I know this is quite a complicated slide, but the point being really that as we age, all of the different cells in our immune system become less functional, just like most of the organs and tissues in our body. We age, things get a little bit slower, we lose the ability to respond to stresses, and in the immune system, it's the same sort of thing. So yes, aging individuals, a lot of you will be familiar with what happened with some of the long-term care facilities with the COVID pandemic. And we all know that aging individuals were much more susceptible to the most severe effects of COVID. So it does increase the risk of infection, but defects in the immune system also contribute to some of these other age-related diseases that we normally don't think are related to the immune system. So things like insulin resistance and diabetes, cardiovascular disease, even Alzheimer's and Parkinson's have immune cell component. And so the potential for immunotherapies, if we understand the role of the immune system in these diseases, is quite significant. So cancer is really at the forefront. Using immunotherapies to treat cancers is really the forefront of medicine these days. And so I'm going to use it as the example to discuss some contexts of immune therapy. So the idea with immune therapy is we're really trying to make the immune system smarter and more effective. And so the question really becomes, how do we harness the immune system to fight disease? And again, when you think about the immune system, you mostly think about infectious disease, but with immunotherapies, we're also trying to target things like non-infectious disease, so non-communicable diseases, these lifestyle diseases that a lot of people are affected by. And so again, like I said, cancer is a really good example, and there have been a number of immunotherapies that are approved for use, but also under development for the treatment of cancer. And so most of the time, these immunotherapies are used in conjunction with other traditional treatments for cancer, like chemotherapies or radiation or surgery, but they're proving to be very successful in some contexts. And there's a number of new drugs that are in the pipeline that are really trying to target the immune system to improve outcomes for patients with cancer. And so there's a variety of different types that are under development, and I'm going to talk about 3 specific examples. So one of the first examples and the most commonly used are things called monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are proteins that are produced by the B cells. They're a type of immune cell that basically serve as a flag for other cells in the immune system to recognize an invader. So in this case, it's not a foreign invader, but it's a cancer cell. So the antibody can actually bind to the cancer cell and serve as a flag to say, look, this cancer cell's here. We need to destroy it, bring in the arsenal to kill and remove this cancer cell. So that's one way in which an antibody can be used. The other way is you can actually have a drug, so a chemotherapeutic drug, and you can actually bind it to the antibody. So it becomes this antibody drug conjugated sort of molecule. And what that allows you to do is now if you have this antibody recognizing a cancer cell, it provides the drugs directly to that cell to kill and destroy only the cancer cell. And the idea there is to hopefully try to limit the side effects of cancer treatments and things like that. And so, like I said, Health Canada and the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, have approved a number of different monoclonal antibodies to treat cancer. And these are just a couple of different examples. The problem and the limitation with these drugs is that you have to find a feature of the cancer cell that's specific only to that cancer cell. And often that's very difficult to do. So often when we're having these drugs, we're actually targeting subsets of cells instead of specifically cancer cells. But it's still better than some of the off-target effects that you suffer from with things like chemotherapy. Another type of immunotherapy that's being developed in the context of treating cancer are called CAR T cell therapies. So what they actually do in this context is they actually remove the T cells, so they perform leukapheresis, where they can actually take a large volume of blood out of the individual with cancer, and they can isolate their T cells, which again is an immune cell that plays an important role in killing cancer cells. And so what happens is that they remove these cells from the blood, they genetically modify them in the lab so they can actually insert a gene that expresses for a protein that can be expressed on the surface of the T cell that allows them to better recognize cancer cells. And so by expressing this CAR protein, the antigen receptor, they can actually, once they're injected back into the body, be better able to kill and destroy cancer cells. And again, a number of these CAR T cell therapies have been approved for use in individuals with cancer. Most of the time it's in children and adults with things like blood cancers, such as leukemia and lymphoma. And often it's in cases where they're refractory or they're not responding to other types of treatments, or they've relapsed after being successfully gone into remission and things like that. So it's usually used in cases where other treatments don't work very well, but it's increasingly being used in a wider range of contexts. The reason that it's generally used in these types of contexts is because it's obviously a very complicated and costly process. And so until we find a way to make this less costly, more effective, it's going to be limited to the cases where they need it the most. And so the last example of an immunotherapy that is under development are called oncolytic viruses. And I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the term, but these are actually viruses that we get exposed to in our environment that actually are able to infect and selectively kill cancer cells. So these viruses can be genetically modified to selectively replicate only in cancer cells. And by replicating inside the cancer cells, it kills the cancer cells and sort of decreases the size of a tumor. The thing that's really interesting and why it's sort of an immunotherapy is what they also find is these viruses, by killing the tumor cells, actually turn on a more effective immune response in the tumor. So it's not just the virus infecting and destroying the cancer cells, but it's also the effects of these dying cells on activating the immune system that plays an important role in turning a cold tumor, which means it has very little immune response, and the cancer cells proliferating out of control, to a hot tumor where you have the immune system able to recognize and destroy cancer cells. So it's actually really cool. They're using all different types of viruses, some that are found in plants, some that are found in humans, some that are found in different types of animals, and they're really trying to understand and optimize their use in different types of tumors, like solid tumors and brain tumors. The only limitation in this sort of systems are really that, if we have been exposed to some of these viruses in the past, they lose their effectiveness because our immune system already recognizes them and clears them before they can kill the cancer cells. The other thing, and what's probably the most difficult thing in the development of oncolytic viruses, is finding a balance, because you obviously want the virus to kill the cancer cells, but you also want to be able to activate the immune response. Problem is, when you activate an immune response, you start to clear the virus. And so it's a delicate balance that has to be sort of met. And so those are just 3 examples of immunotherapies in the context of cancer. There are a variety of other opportunities for immunotherapies, both in, again, the realm of infectious disease and non-infectious disease. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about all of the concern about antimicrobial resistance, so things like antibiotic resistance, and how we're going to have a number of diseases soon that we do not have treatments available for. There's been a limited number of new antibiotics, that have been discovered as of late. And so one of the ideas now is to, instead of targeting the bacteria, which is what we do with antibiotics, can we target the immune system to make them better able to respond to some of these bacteria that are resistant to other types of treatments? And so it's probably going to be using antibiotics and immune therapies together to treat some of these infections, but it represents something very promising, because obviously there's no possibility for resistance because you're targeting the host or the immune system instead of bacteria itself. In treating HIV infection, so this is sort of similar to what we did with the CAR T cells to treat cancer. What you can actually do is isolate blood cells from an individual with HIV. And what you do, instead of isolating the T cells, you isolate a different subset of cells called monocytes. And what you do is you expose them, or you treat them with the virus. And what happens is they take up that virus and they present it on the surface of their cell membrane. And then when they get injected back into the individual with HIV, those proteins can activate the T cell response. So it makes the immune system better able to recognize and respond to infection, and hopefully help cure the disease eventually. There's also a lot of work going into immunotherapies for things like allergies. So, most people, when you think about allergies, you think about things like hay fever, but there's obviously some very severe allergies to things like peanuts, where it's life-threatening if you get exposed. And so there's a lot of work going into developing immunotherapies to target especially these most extreme cases where you end up with anaphylaxis and sort of more severe consequences. And so there's things like microdosing, so you can receive small amounts of the allergen, so in this case, the peanut, and it actually trains your immune system to be tolerant to that allergen. And so you, over time, lose the ability, or you lose the allergic response. So it's about retraining the immune system to not recognize that peanut allergen anymore. So it's very cool, the immunology that goes into some of that. And then they're even using immunotherapies now for things like Alzheimer's disease. And so when everyone thinks about Alzheimer's disease, you think about sort of these plaques that form between the cells in the brain. And what you can actually do is make the immune cells better able to remove and destroy those plaques. So what you can do is you can treat them with different things like bacterial components or different immune activators to activate the cells. And by activating the cells, they're better able to remove and destroy things like the amyloid plaques and things. So it's really very interesting, and a lot of progress is being made in the context of using immunotherapies in the context of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other types of brain-based diseases. So Yeah, and really this is a lot. I wouldn't even call it the future of medicine. I would say that this is something that's happening now and represents a lot of what's going to be coming into the clinic in the future. So again, immunotherapies are very potent, not only for treating infectious diseases and cancers, but other types of disease. So obviously there's the ones that are associated with immune dysfunction, like autoimmune diseases and allergies, but also other diseases that we don't generally think about in the context of the immune system. So, things like cardiovascular disease and neurological diseases. And so to do that, what we do is we really need to understand more about how the immune system works and how it becomes dysregulated in the context of disease. And so it's about understanding not only the environmental factors, but the genetic factors that control not only when an immune cell gets turned on and how strong of a response it induces, but also how it gets shut off and how you regulate its functionality. Because obviously the immune system, it's a great thing to have when you have an infection, but when it becomes overactivated, it can also cause disease and damage. So it's really going to be a lot of where the future is going with medicine. And so it's going to be exciting to be involved in this type of area of research. So yeah, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say.